Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Laura Kramer. I work for the Accelerating Impacts of CGIAR Climate Research for Africa program called ICRA. And I'm based at the Alliance of Biodiversity and CIAT, and I sit in Kenya. So welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. And thank you for joining us. The webinar today is presenting research from our previous program, the CCAFS program, which was the CGIAR Research Program for Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security, which ran for about 12 years, from 2009 to just ending last year. And as part of that program, we did a lot of work at the ground level in many different countries, and we collected a lot of survey data. And so we put together a research team to analyze that data. And what they have reported is going to be shared today in this webinar. So we're looking at measuring livelihood changes across households, implementing climate smart agriculture. And so a little bit of background on this study. I've mentioned it comes out of the work of the CCAFS program, and CCAFS operated for more than a decade in 5 different regions. It was active in East and West Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. And during that time, we had many different research sites on the ground where we implemented climate smart agriculture. And we started out doing baseline surveys at all of those sites and collected a lot of data. When we designed the instruments, we weren't even really sure what the interventions were going to be. So the baseline instruments were designed to be quite broad and collect a lot of different information on households and their practices, their group memberships, their use of weather forecasts, their assets, their food security. It was really a broad survey. And so after implementing the project CCAFS for almost 10 years, we said, let's do some end-line surveys and see what has changed in these sites, because we really wanted to know what have been those changes over time. And so we used the same instruments, we redid them. We couldn't do it in all the sites where we had operated because of financial and time constraints, but we did manage to do those end-line surveys in 6 of the sites. And so the team that will be presenting today will present the synthesis, the analysis of the data from those sites. And so I want to just give that as a background. They will talk more about the specific sites that are included and what their findings have been. But it's important for us to be learning from this information, because as we continue now with the new ICRA program, we want to learn what has worked, what are people doing, what can we do differently to help improve the implementation of climate smart agriculture. So we'll have first a presentation of the findings from the study, and that will be done. We'll have Dr. Kristal Jones. She'll be starting off. She's a principal researcher with JG Research and Evaluation. She has a PhD in sociology and is an expert in agricultural research and applied theories of development. And then Dr. Meredith Niles will also contribute to the presentation. She's an associate professor at the University of Vermont, and she's used a lot of this CCAFS data over the years in different research projects. And she does interdisciplinary research on the interface of social ecological food systems. And then we'll have 2 of our CCAFS, now ICRA scientists, give their reflections on the findings. We'll have Dr. John Reicha, who is based at ILRI in East Africa, and Dr. Mathieu Wadrogo from the Alliance based in West Africa, give us their perspectives from the work that they did on the ground. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end of the session. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Type any questions in there. You can also use the chat for making comments, but if you have specific questions, please use the Q&A. So thank you for attending. We're glad to have you here. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kristal. So please, Kristal, go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Laura, and thanks everyone for this opportunity. All right. Laura, can you just confirm the screen looks okay?
Yes, thank you.
Awesome. Always good to triple check. All right, yeah, so my name is Kristal Jones. I worked with Meredith Niles on this kind of analytical portion of this project, building on, as Laura just overviewed, a huge and diverse amount of work done in the CCAFS program over the last decade or more. And the purpose of this analysis is to really focus in on the kind of sets of indicators that look at livelihoods and changes in livelihoods over time. So we're going to talk a bit today about, mostly we're going to talk about the results, and Meredith will really dig in there. But I'm going to kind of set the stage at the front end and back end in terms of what the countries and the data sets we were working with, but also offer some at the end, some methodological and kind of data-oriented reflections, which we're hopeful will contribute to the ongoing learning and just planning for the ICRA program as it moves forward and continues this good work of longitudinal data collection. Oh, of course, now my screen doesn't want to let me move. There we go. So just to give a brief snapshot kind of the analysis of where these multiple waves of household surveys were done and where we were able to use those data to look at some of these changes over time. We focused in on 6 CCAFS sites across 5 countries, and across 3 regions, 3 of the 5 regions of the world. So you can kind of see the distribution here, looking across West Africa, East Africa, and South Asia. In total, we looked at, like I said, about 800 or 900 households total. We were focused on the household data collection that happened in the CCAFS surveys, not the kind of village and organizational levels. And one of the amazing things, and I feel like it's important to sort of really emphasize this at the outset, was just how many households were able to be included in both baseline and endline surveys. I mean, as so many of you are well aware, panel surveys are really challenging to find the same people in the same places over time. And that's what makes it possible to really look at change over time in a detailed and systematic way. And so when we look at the number of respondents, those are the number of households that were in the endline survey or the baseline survey. And I believe there were only 1 or 2 households across all 6 sites that weren't able to be found or in some way engaged at the endline survey. So that in and of itself is really exciting. And I know is the work of a huge amount of people on this call and a huge amount of energy that everyone's put into that. So you can see here kind of the specific sites, the countries, et cetera. We looked at, again, kind of the indicators of these core categories of change that were of interest to the CCAFS program. So looking at changes in over 70 practices and household outcomes. So some demographic characteristics, but mostly kind of economics, livelihoods outcomes, as well as social outcomes in terms of relationships, networks, participation in organizations. And we were really focused on what was happening at baseline, what was happening at endline, and then thinking about the changes between baseline and endline, and what does that mean for how do we think about adoption rates looking at those changes. CCAFS promoted about 31 practices specifically, and so we kind of honed in on what were the effects of the CCAFS program potentially on that promotion of certain practices, and sort of looking at impact in terms of change or adoption. So a kind of, again, quick kind of stage setting in terms of some of those household changes that we were, that CCAFS is interested in and that we looked at. We see some overall the sort of trends and headed in a very positive direction. Increases in educational attainment in about 2/3 of the sites. Increases in female-headed households, which, depending on the reason for that may or may not be positive, but certainly it's really important to know in terms of targeting programming and ongoing, well, I guess new programs in the context of ICRA, thinking about who exactly is leading households, what needs do they have, and what access to what types of resources, et cetera. And then we saw significant increases in household assets, so kind of material assets, as well as structural assets, so things about people's physical homes, as well as their kind of agricultural settings. And so we can just see, if we look at the average number of household assets in almost all sites, that average number increased. And so I'm going to turn it over to Meredith now to really dig into the results, and I will advance the slides.
Thank you so much, Kristal, and good to be here with everyone this morning, afternoon, and evening, depending on where you are. So I'm going to detail some of the key results, and I believe Laura put the link to the full report in the chat. We don't have enough time today to go into all the details. We're going to hone in on 3 specific areas. So first, what we found in terms of changes in adoption of climate smart agriculture practices. Second, changes that we observed in social networks and social information, including forecasts. And then finally, changes in economics, markets, and food security. And as I noted, or as Kristal noted, CCAFS did ask about 70 different practices in their 2 different surveys. So we're going to give you just a snapshot of the big picture highlights today. And the report is available if you want to dig in further. Next slide, Kristal. So to set the stage with the big picture overview, and then I'll dig into some of the specific practices further. Among those more than 70 practices that CCAFS asked about, what we're showing here are the ones that were overall most and least adopted at any point in time during the 2 surveys. So what we see is that the highest adoption of practices among households are related to crop varietal changes and the use of inputs in the last 12 months. We're seeing changes in hiring tractors and farm labor as well. And then conversely, what we're finding is that the lowest adoption of practices over time at any point is really ones related to water, agroecological practices, salinity, and toxicity tolerant varieties. And we'll talk a little bit more about these details moving forward. Kristal, next slide. So digging into adoption of crop varieties. So what you can see here in the graphic on the right is a suite of different practices related to crops that CCAFS asked about. And this is the percent of all adoption of these practices occurring after the baseline survey that CCAFS did. So this is the percent of adoption that we might be able to attribute to CCAFS impacts and various aspects on the ground. And what I've highlighted here in red really shows that there was a lot of action around introducing new crops and testing new crops. And those were new kinds of adoption that could be related to CCAFS. So more than half of new crop adoption occurred in 4 out of 6 sites after that first survey. And more than half of testing of new crops occurred in almost all sites after baseline. And CCAFS, we know, promoted improved varieties and new crops. And in our analysis, we did show that there was a significant increase in adoption in those places where CCAFS actually promoted these kinds of practices. Next slide. When we look at adoption of land and water management practices, you can see here on the right a graphic that shows you the percent of households that had ever adopted any of these practices. And so as you can see at the top, the most common practices that we see people adopting are land management practices, area reduction or expansion, land preparation, planting preparation, intercropping. But as you can see further down the bottom, that there are fewer soil and water management practices that have been implemented in CCAFS sites across this 10-year time period. So it's much less likely we see households using cover crops, terracing, integrated crop management, mulching, hedges, etc. But we do find some evidence of CCAFS impact in several places related to these practices. So first of all, we found a significant increase potentially related to CCAFS promotion for bunds, crop rotations, and mulching in Ghana. And we found a significant increase potentially related to CCAFS promotion for terraces and ridges in Kenya. Looking at the adoption of animal practices, now recognize not all smallholders have animals in all places, but looking at those that did, We did see that there was not overall many improved animal practices adopted over time. So this graphic on the right is showing the percent of all animal practices that happened after baseline, after that first survey. And I've highlighted here in red some of the specific details that we might want to highlight that demonstrate where the majority of adoption happened after baseline. You can see that most of the majority of adoption for certain practices occurred in Kenya and Haryana. Those are places where we see things like new animals being introduced, new breeds, or cut and carry systems or improved pasture systems in India, for example. And in our analysis, we did find evidence that CCAFS promotion was significant for fisheries promotion in Bangladesh and for improved breeds or new breeds introduced in Kenya. Looking at the adoption of water management practices, so the majority of adoption of tanks, infrastructure, and solar water pumps was new, as you can see highlighted here in the horizontal coverage. And that's especially true in places like Bangladesh and Haryana, as well as Ghana. And then we also see, if you advance, Kristal, that in Kenya, the majority of almost all water management practices happened after baseline. So what we've honed in on here is really showing that drip irrigation and tanks, dams and water pumps, boreholes, as well as different kinds of water pumps, almost all of that adoption was new in Kenya since the baseline survey. And we do see significant impact of CCAFS promotion for boreholes and water pumps in Nepal, and also for water harvesting and dams in Kenya. CCAFS asked a number of questions about tree management practices, 4 different aspects of that. What we're showing here is just the results from the trees protected in the last 12 months. And this is a slightly different graph. So the dark blue dot indicates the percent of households that had protected trees at baseline. The lighter blue are percent of households that had adopted tree protection at end lines. And then green are times that people did both practices. And then finally in orange, you can see the percent of households that had ever protected trees. We break this down further in the report by all of the tree protection and all of the tree practices. But we do find a significant increase in tree protection in all sites except for one. And we also find that the majority of households outside of India have protected trees or planted trees between baseline and end line. CCAFS asked about purchased inputs as well. These questions were worded slightly differently. These questions were asked about in the last 12 months. So we're really only able to look at a snapshot of baseline last 12 months and end line survey last 12 months. But what we do see here, as indicated earlier, is that a majority of households used purchase inputs at some time, whether baseline or end line in all sites. And you can see that here in orange again, so you can see the percent of total households ever using inputs. And in our analysis, looking at the potential impact of CCAFS, we do see some statistically significant differences here. And we see that there is increased adoption that could be attributed to CCAFS promotion around purchased seeds in all sites except for India, fertilizer in 3 out of 6 sites, pesticides and herbicides in 4 out of 6 sites, and veterinary medicines in Ghana. And here we're just showing the graphic for improved and purchased seed, but we go into these details further in the report for the other inputs as well. Okay, so 2 more blocks of results to share. That was a snapshot on what we saw in terms of practice adoption changes. Let's hone in on information and social networks. Some really interesting results here as well. So CCAFS promoted weather forecasts in many sites across those 6 areas. And what we see overall is that 88% of respondent households had received a weather forecast at end line on average. And in the graphic shown down here below, you can see the changes. We find a significant increase in the households receiving weather forecasts in 4 out of 6 sites, Bangladesh, Ghana, Bihar, and Nepal. And CCAFS was also interested in understanding whether women in households were receiving forecasts. And this data is not shown here, but what we do find and is reported further in our detailed report is that we find a significant increase in the percent of women that are focused on receiving forecasts in 4 out of 6 sites. And when we looked at the potential impact of CCAFS in terms of where they promoted these practices, we do find this impact is significant in Ghana, Kenya, and both India sites as well. Of course, receiving a forecast is only one part of it. We were also trying to understand whether people were using these forecasts. And what we find is that there is a significant increase on average. 2/3 of households at Endline survey were using forecasts as compared to 53% at baseline. And we see that these increases are significant in Bangladesh, Bihar, and Nepal, though we do note, as you can see here, there was a decrease in use of forecasts in Kenya. This, I think, is one of the most interesting and exciting results that we were able to uncover. So on average, we see that there was a doubling of group membership among households between baseline and Endline across these sites. So at baseline, on average, households were a member of a group less than one group, 0.62 groups on average. And at Endline, we see that the average number of groups that a household is a member of, ranging from soil and land water management groups to credit savings groups to marketing groups, was more than 1.3. And interestingly, the largest change that we saw here, which is shown in the graphic, is that the significant increase in credit and savings group membership in 4 out of 6 sites. And so you can see there's some very significant increases in the percent of households belonging to a credit or savings group across many of these sites, particularly Ghana, both sites in India and Kenya as well. And then lastly, to wrap up some of our results before I turn it back to Kristal for some implications, economics, market, and food security findings. So related to that increase in credit and savings groups, we also find a significant increase in the percent of households that are using agricultural credit between baseline and Endline. And so what you can see here in the graphic in dark blue are the percent of households in a site that had adopted agricultural credit. And then in lighter blue are the percent of households that had adopted agricultural credit at Endline, or the percent of all households that had adopted between baseline and Endline. And so you can see across all sites, we actually see a significant increase in agricultural credit use. In some cases, the adoption of credit is significant, and the majority of adoption occurs after the baseline survey. And we were able to determine that this impact was significant in Ghana and Nepal, specifically where CCAFS had promoted agricultural credit in particular. One aspect that we were interested in understanding was the production of products on farm. CCAFS had very detailed surveys looking at the amount of crops and the kinds of crops that were produced. And what we find overall across time is that there is a general product simplification across all of these farms. So in all sites, we see that there's a significant decrease in the number of crops on average that are produced at each site. And so what you can see in this graphic in dark blue are the total number of crops on average, or products, I should say. It would include animal products as well, produced at baseline. And then in light blue are the total number of products produced on average at Endline. So we do see significant decreases across all sites, and that's in particular also significant in the number of products sold in Ghana and Nepal, but we actually see an increase in the number of products sold in Kenya. And then our last slide of results focused on food security, which is a major a livelihood outcome for CCAFS. This is where a lot of my work has been with CCAFS previously. We find some mixed results here, and we know there's a lot of other factors at play that have to be considered when we look at these results. So we do find significant decreases in food insecurity outcomes in Bangladesh and Ghana, as you can see here. This is showing the average months of food insecurity faced by a household at baseline in blue and at end line in orange. And so in Bangladesh and Ghana, the reduction in food insecurity is significant. However, we do see significant increases in food insecurity in Bihar and Kenya. And unfortunately, one of the confounding factors here is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so the data in Kenya in particular was collected after the COVID-19 pandemic began. It was collected in 2021. And so unfortunately, it's a little challenging to unpack the potential of CCAFS impact in this area. Next slide. So I'll turn it back to my colleague Kristal now, who will provide some oversight of some of our key findings and then some recommendations that, that our team has made as we think about future surveys and data collection moving forward.
Great, thanks, Meredith. Yeah, so like Meredith said, I'm just going to kind of summarize a bit and then offer some next step reflections. Excuse me. So I think, as we put all of this together, what we've talked about today, as well as a lot more detail and kind of specifics that we detail in the report, when we put it all together, our kind of overall key finding is that farmers or producers really seem to be intensifying. If we think about the most and least adopted practices in this figure on the right, and as Meredith talked about, agroecological practices or kind of more integrated or holistic practices, climate smart agriculture practices, it sort of varies depending on the type of practice, but agroecological practices are not nearly as have not been nearly as adopted across these sites throughout the time period that the CCAFS surveys and the CCAFS program covered. And we all know that there's a whole set of practices that can go together in all kinds of different ways. And so it's not, what we're identifying here is just to say that it seems like labor, inputs, and machinery do seem to be one of the places that producers are really experimenting with, adopting, and kind of overall potentially intensifying their systems using some of those practices. We also see a lot of testing of new crops and using of inputs, and those are all types of seed varieties and all types of inputs, right? Organic and inorganic. So again, it's not that there's any one path people are going down necessarily, but overall, we're kind of seeing this increased engagement with certain types of technologies and practices, and not as much full adoption. Maybe there's experimentation, but not as much full adoption of agroecological practices. As Meredith said, some of the findings that we think are really exciting and really speak to some of the priorities of the CCAFS program are around kind of some of the social networks and the social dimensions of climate smart agriculture. So really thinking about receiving and actually using weather forecasts, thinking about whether women have access to that information and if and how they are using it, thinking about increases in group memberships, using agricultural credit. So again, when we put it all together, there's a huge amount of diversity, right? But a kind of whole set of practices that we see somewhat moving in the same direction. And so when we think about what we've learned, what we know about the priorities of the CCAFS program and these impacts that we found, as well as impacts that many of you and others, your colleagues, have documented over time, kind of thinking about future opportunities, one of the big ones is to really understand and take a holistic view of the impact of these adopted practices, right? So if we think about household surveys asking people what they've done, sometimes asking why they've done it, but for the most part focused on the what, right? Which is the starting point to understand change. We have to know what people were doing and are doing and what that looks like over time. But going forward, to kind of add to that some on-farm measurement of the biophysical conditions of soil and other environmental conditions to kind of understand, well, what are the impacts of those practice changes? And then also to kind of look at the impacts, the social and economic impacts of some of these social and economic aspects or practices, so to speak, that are part of climate smart agriculture. So to understand kind of what do people see as the impact of using climate forecasts, for example, how do some of these new practices affect not only productivity, but also kind of labor demands, maybe household dynamics, economic returns, opportunities for market access. So really taking the systems perspective, which is already built into climate smart agriculture and certainly was built into the CCAFS program, but in a world with infinite resources, to be able to really couple some of these survey data collection methods with some other types of observation and data collection would allow for taking a couple steps further and really understanding impact. We also thought a lot, and as Meredith noted, she's done a lot of work on this, as I know many of you have, in thinking about the ultimately food and nutrition security being a really important outcome of all of this work, right? Ultimately thinking about the human health and well-being implications of changing practices, of being able to adapt to climate variability. And so, one future opportunity we see is sort of to build out the food security and the nutrition security component of household surveys. There are several indices and kind of approaches to measuring food security that have come out of USAID work. There's many others out there. Something is relatively simple as 24-hour dietary recall is a really good starting point to understand, again, sort of how do we go from practices that might change production as well as change market access, but really understanding what's the link between what's being produced and accessed and how does that actually impact consumption, dietary diversity, and then ultimately, nutritional outcomes. And then finally, continuing to really think about gender disaggregated data and analysis. And I think that is especially relevant if we think about the impacts. And so, kind of data collection efforts that say, okay, what are the practices being adopted and the types of opportunities people are taking advantage of? How do those vary by gender and gender role? And then also, how do the impacts of those practices vary by gender? So really, kind of thinking both about adoption and impact and disaggregating it in both of those steps of the process. And then, in the course of this project, we spent a lot of time deep in the data, and of course had some thoughts about kind of ways to build on what the CCAFS program did, and I would say especially the approaches that were taken at the N-line survey. Standardizing data collection tools, frameworks, truly literally the technology, right? The use of the Kobo toolbox, which I know was used for several of the N-line surveys, which was new to me as a tool. I'd heard of it, but not used it. And it was incredibly exciting to see kind of what that looks like, that you can have exactly the same survey deployed in different parts of the world, adapted if you need to adapt it to specific local conditions or topics, but it provides this consistent starting point that means the data that comes out on the other end is also consistent and much easier to streamline, not only that collection phase, but also the data analysis phase. So continuing to use tools like that and sort of having standardization and consistency in mind sets up the ability to do these cross-site comparisons and also comparisons over time. Related to that, and kind of some specific, things to standardize, I suppose, one thing that's really important in longitudinal or in panel data collection is the use of a unique identifier for each household, so that we know when we go back there 10 years later that data point 2 is connected to data point 1 for the same household, right? And so, none of these are things that didn't happen. They're more just to point to sort of the key decisions that were made in the CCAFS program and that really enabled us to be able to put these data together in this way, and just sort of a vote to continue some of these approaches, and definitely assigning a unique identifier and making sure that even as project teams change over the years, that those unique identifiers are used consistently. Similarly, and kind of zooming out a bit, I think having robust metadata is really important for everyone, for people like Meredith and I who might be coming in toward the end of data collection and wanting to do some analysis and understand what's in there, but also, again, to support changes over time in survey teams or in the program teams, so that everybody knows what's been done and can build on what's been done in a way that is consistent. And then sort of some more data management things. The unique identifier is somewhat of a data management issue as well. Small things like standardizing the use of missing data values. So was something missing because someone refused to answer versus was something missing because it wasn't a relevant question to them. It was a question about livestock and they don't have livestock. And having different values for different reasons that data is missing is actually really helpful and important, in data analysis. So for example, as Meredith noted, if not all households have livestock, and so in our analysis, we tried to separate out just households who said at some time point that they had livestock, for example, or if initial livestock question, if they answered not relevant to me, then we didn't include them in that analysis. So, having those signifiers being precise allows for more precise analysis. So again, all of these things were built into the CCAFS data collection over time, and sort of we highlight them here mostly to say that they were really helpful to us as we were engaging in this analysis, and that certainly they should be carried forward in future household and survey data collection. So that's all. That's kind of the fairly brief summary of what is a much longer report. We're excited to talk more about it and hear from our colleagues. We wanted to quickly acknowledge the folks who made sort of the CCAFS work overall possible and made our work possible on this project. So Philip Thornton, who was the original lead of this work within the CCAFS program, Laura Kramer, who's really been our point person and consistent collaborator in the data and the kind of interpretation side of things. Vincent Alulu, who I'm not sure if he's on this call, but he worked with us a lot at the beginning of our work to contribute and lead some of the data cleaning and management. Many of the people who worked on these projects over time, the Statistics for Sustainable Development team in particular, provided us a lot of insight on the work that they've done in the past. And then really acknowledging the CCAFS country teams that collected these data over the course of close to 10 years across the 5 countries. We've really appreciated not only the work you did that allowed us to do this analysis, but also the ongoing engagement and help in kind of interpreting and explaining what we were seeing. So we made sure that things were as accurate as possible. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to CCAFS colleagues to continue.
Thank you so much, Kristal and Meredith. This is super engaging. We have a lot of comments and questions coming in, so people are really interested in this, and it's great to be getting all of this engagement. So thank you to everyone who's been posting comments and questions. That's really great. So let me ask Matthew and John to turn on their cameras, and we'll ask them to give us some insights from on the ground. So John was the participatory action research scientist based in East Africa and knows the Kenya site of Nyando very well. And he was really engaged in the surveys, in the promotion of the different practices and technologies, and can really speak to how things looked on the ground. And then Matthew was the counterpart of John in West Africa and knows the West African sites quite well, especially the one in Ghana, where that was included in this study. So I want to just ask them to share with us their experiences and tell us, is what the data are showing, are those what rings true from on the ground. So let's start with John. Do these findings resonate with you and what you saw on the ground in the research sites? I'm not hearing John. Are others hearing John? So sorry.
No, unfortunately not, Laura.
Try again, John. No. John, can you try and maybe switch the microphone? We'll sort that out. Let's go to Matthew and hear about the West Africa perspective while we get John's microphone working. Matthew?
Okay, thank you, Laura. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. So I will say that most of the results that Meredith and Kristal show are in line with what we can see on the ground in West Africa, basically in Ghana. And here I would like to highlight things that we can easily observe without, some specific study. And if I go through some changes that they mentioned, we can see that regarding the changes in household asset, for instance, actually, if you are in the CSV in Ghana, you can observe, the improvement of the housing. For instance, this is something you can easily see. We can see also the increase of the number of motor bicycle in the area, and also the access to electricity, for instance. And if you go, for instance, on the adoption side of CSA technology and practices, the great example that you can really see on the ground now is the adoption of tile ridges. And these are what they say water and soil conservation techniques, and we can really observe them everywhere in the field. So this is something we can easily observe on the field. In terms of information and social network, I like the fact that, for instance, ESOCO is well known in the CSV site as one of the company which used to provide climate information services, but also market services. So those are something, if you are on the ground, you can easily observe. And in terms of economic indicators, just as, for instance, the income improvement or food security, there are some success stories on how CCAF activities have impacted the livelihood of farmers. And one of the famous examples that you can maybe see through the website, it's the story of from Derek Christopher, who is a farmer from one of the CSV, Bompari, and he really gives some testimony where he really increased his maize production from the use of climate information. Those are things really we can observe, and we don't really need some study, but study come to make this really a scientific way. And apart from that, there are some things that I wanted to highlight. Maybe we cannot really see from the study. And this is, for instance, the reduction of youth migration in the region. We are working in Ghana in the Upper West region, and this region is one of the poorest in Ghana. And people use, to migrate to other regions. And after the activity of CCAF, with the improvement of the livelihood, we notice a reduction of the youth migration. When we are also discussing with people, this is coming. And the second thing is also the improvement of the landscape, I will say the vegetation cover. Through the technology we implement there are, for instance, tree planting and farm managed natural generation. And these also contribute to change, the landscape in terms of vegetation cover. And the good thing also in this region, people reduce the bushfire, and this also contributed to improve I will say the landscape. The last thing, very interesting, is the change in terms of mindset. This is something difficult to capture from some quantitative survey. This required, for instance, a particular observation in the site. And today, if you pick any farmer in the CSV site of Ghana, and you engage some kind of discussion of them on, for instance, climate information, climate change, all those, the impact, the causes of climate change, you will be really surprised to see that people have a knowledge on the topic. And this is something very interesting that we can notice, because it's basically these mindsets that really contribute to the change of other factors like the adoption of climate smart technology and practices, and those also contribute to improve the livelihood in general. So these are something I wanted to add in addition to the result of the survey that really you can observe in the CSV site of Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you so much. John, over to you, your impressions?
Yes, you can hear me now? Thank you. My impressions are information gathered actually validates what has been going on in the past 12 years in the Nyando climate smart villages. Specifically, we began in a participatory way where we engage the community in knowing what are the climate risks that are there, and then what could be the opportunities in terms of activities to be done in a basket of options. And farmers end up selecting options that are relevant for them in that participatory manner, together with the community leaders and the local administrators, that's in the county governments of Kericho and Kisumu counties where this site is located. The key amongst them, which farmers followed up very much, was starting off was the use of improved and more resilient small ruminants of the red Maasai sheep as well as the Gala goats, which replace the small East African sheep and goats, which in this case had a faster growth in terms of competitive growth after drought, for example, and were able to withstand pests and diseases and especially internal parasites, and could be able to fetch a much better price. And that has been a hit up to date, even as we go right now into the community. You see, more than a third of the small ruminants are of that type or breeds altogether. Then in terms of crop changes, the biggest was around the use of improved varieties. These are varieties that are either drought tolerant, are capable of withstanding pests altogether and or tolerating some diseases. And at the same time, they are high yielding. They range from the cereals to the legumes. Hence, in the study, you found out that there was improved and increased level of improved crop variety use. Then there was now the method of growing. The agronomic practices end up improving to have more of the intercross of crops of cereal legume, and then the method of early cropping so that they could be able to make use of the season adequately. Something that came up as time went by was due to the input in terms of technical assistance by the agricultural extension services from the government as well as from the community that were being trained. It helped to have people have more knowledge, and therefore they ended up now getting into a lot of activities that involved integrated nutrient management. And generally, in between here, in the years 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, even before the Midland survey, we had annual monitoring that captured these increments that were being done by the farmers, and also the aspect of water harvesting, the terrace using altogether to address soil and water erosion altogether, erosion, and then there was the agroforestry component that was big within. Now, interestingly, seasonal weather forecast was taken up at the beginning, very much in the early years, and as time went by, many of the farmers on their own had learned after being trained through the participatory integrated climate monitoring system altogether to be able to make use of the available weather forecasts either by radio or from TV, and then those which are coming in through the phones, through the agro advisories, to be able to make decisions about land preparation, when to plant, and the type of variety to end up planting altogether, and then that helped improve the harvests. So the one finding that I would like basically to explain is one around food insecurity. We did the survey in June 2021 when Kenya had undergone a 1.5-year lockdown due to COVID-19. It led to massive disruption in the economy of the country, and that ended up showing that there was a reduction in the food security sectors altogether. But the assessment that we had done in the year 2019 and 2018 had shown an increment in food security within the community. So I can just basically say one of the findings could be due to COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thanks so much. So we have 10 minutes left. We have a lot of questions, but I know Meredith and Kristal are answering some online so that you can read those answers in the boxes. I want to stay with Matthew and John because I think they can help us answer some of these. So Matthew, I want to go back to you. And I know you have done a lot of gender research within CCAFS and now with the Alliance. And so there have been some questions around gender and also the involvement of youth. Can you talk a little bit about how we started in CCAFS and what the baseline, how the baselines included gender and where we are now, and how we've evolved a little bit in our research on gender and youth, and what still needs to be done?
Thank you very much, Laura. So in terms of gender, when we started the work at CCAFS, the baseline work is at several levels. We have the baseline at household level, we have the baseline at the village level, and we have the baseline at landscape level, organizational level. And basically at the household, at the village level, we use really the participatory approach with gender lens. Everything we did, we use those focus group discussion, and everything, the diagnosis, the definition of the vision of the future for the community, and the activity we are identified to implement to reach this vision. All those things have been done separately by men and women, and at the end we aggregated that information to have like a community-based vision. So we took into account the gender issue. Now, for the household survey, normally the baseline doesn't really make the difference in terms of men and women, because we focus on household, and it's the household head who is really targeting. So, but after 3 years of implementation, we realized that we have to address this issue. So we conducted some CSA monitoring, these climate smart village activity monitoring, where we target in the household, the men and the women, and also the young people, And then we have actually some information regarding the perception, the use of the perception of the technology we are promoting, the use of this technology, and the perceived impact of this technology by gender. Those kind of information, we have them through the monitoring and evaluation activity. So we really address the gender issue in the activity, but we still need to continue doing that. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. And I've posted a link in the chat on some other gender work that we did in CCAFS, because I think when we started, the baseline, it was female-headed households, male-headed households, and we realized as we went that this wasn't really the way to go about it. And so our thinking really did evolve, and we have a great gender researcher, Dr. Sophia Heyer, who worked in CCAFS and now is with us in ICRA to continue that research. So we have tried to kind of evolve how we approach gender. And unfortunately, I don't think got it quite right at the baseline. And so that's why a lot of the data that you saw presented here isn't gender disaggregated, unfortunately, but we are trying to improve. So John, I want to ask you, there was a question about scaling and some of the challenges to that. So, we've shifted from CCAFS into ICRA. CCAFS was a research for development program. ICRA is much more of an implementation program. And so what do you see as the key areas going forward for taking what we've learned here and scaling it out and really reaching more farmers? What do you see as the key issues there?
Involvement of the local government was important in the course of doing our work, especially in the climate smart villages in Western Kenya. And for example, in Kenya, agricultural activities are devolved to the counties, but not at the state national level. So that helped in terms of the county governments of Kericho and Kisumu engaging with the farmers in the local community. But the innovative way we did it was that we end up engaging farmers through community-based organizations. These community-based organizations are registered, they have got bank accounts, they are legal entities, and hence it was easier to have these community-based organizations, which are composed of either women-only groups or men and women combined groups altogether, as well as youth groups, although the majority, which had men and women combined, had over 60% women membership in these community-based organizations. Now, the community-based organizations have picked up on their own and they're engaging the private sector. They are able to go on and actually have negotiate with the microfinance institution altogether for some funds to be able to undertake specific climate smart agriculture activities, as well as with aggregators to be able to sell their produce at a better price. And then at the same time, they're also engaging the local government just to ensure that they can send in agricultural officers to guide them in terms of agronomic, also underwater management, conservation activities. So I see involvement of stakeholders, the private sector, very key, as well as the local government, together with the community groups in advancing scaling. But there's still work to be done because the modalities of scaling differ depending on the specific enabling environment. And so for Kenya, because of the developed community, agricultural function of the counties, it is being done at the local level within the county kind of piecing together. So moving from one county to another needs involvement at the higher level of the county government leaders to be able to do things across the different counties, for example. However, from the subnational level to the national level, this is something that is supposed to be done with involvement of the national government and appropriate scaling support policy together with partners, the private sector, to be able to take it that is scaling out as well as scaling up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have just 3 minutes left, but I want to hand it over to Meredith to talk a little bit about this question about agroecology and agroecological practices that has come up. Meredith?
Sure. Thanks, Laura, for the opportunity. So I think there's a couple of things. I've answered some questions in the chat and the Q&A here, but one thing I want to be clear to say is that we aren't saying that there's been no adoption of agroecological practices. In particular, intercropping and stopping burning are two practices that we see overall have high level of adoption across CCAFS sites, though most of that adoption was not new. So those were things that were happening before baseline. However, what we do want to highlight is just the opportunity that we see as we think about the least adopted practices. And those are largely water-related practices and practices related to agroecology or agroecological practices, climate smart practices in cropping systems. So I just want to clarify that we certainly want to acknowledge the great adoption that has occurred on a number of more agroecological practices. But just to note that for the future, as we think about what is least adopted, this is a potential opportunity and area for further research. And our team is continuing to do data analysis as well. I mean, this is just a big high-level snapshot, but a lot of our future work is also going to try to link these pieces together in more causal ways to understand the larger impact and drivers of some of these changes over time. So we'll continue to keep you all updated on that research. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of the hour. Thank you all for being with us. I hope that you have learned something, maybe questioned something. I think it has given us things to think about. I've put the link to the full report in the chat again, so you can go to that and dig into more of the details. And maybe Meredith and Kristal, if you want to put your emails, or John and Matthew, if you want to put your emails in the chat box if anybody has further comments, and we will save the chat and go through those so that we can kind of look at what came up and what else we need to address. We'll be sharing the slides and the recording over email when this is finished, so you'll be getting an email from us. And I just want to say thanks to Meredith, to Kristal, John, and Matthew for joining and sharing their insights and experiences with us. And thanks to all of you for joining. Have a good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you.